Heterogametic sex is, can be dependent upon whether we're talking about XY chromosome arrangement or X or ZW chromosome arrangement. It can vary across different species. We talked about sex-linked traits, such as eye color in flies. We walked through some examples of different crosses that you can have and how that can be complicated because while it largely follows a Mendelian type inheritance, the thing that's complicated about that is that the heterogametic sex, if we're talking about XY chromosome arrangement, that's going to be males. They only have one, say, X chromosome. So therefore, they can't be heterozygous. They cannot have two copies of a gene because they only have one opportunity. They only have one X. So therefore, inheritance is somewhat complicated. The other thing is that we talked about is X inactivation, that in females, many mammals, including humans, there's the issue of gene dosing. So a typical body doesn't necessarily want all the genes that are available on both X chromosomes to be expressed in the same level because males, they only have one copy and there's lots and lots of genes on that X chromosome, like 800 some genes. And so it would be crazy to have all those genes expressed on both chromosomes in females. So there's a mechanism that they have where they inactivate X in a random way. And we talked about that. And that results in bar bodies in females, but not in males. So we talked about other sex differences, right, such as, or dimorphisms, ovaries, vaginas, the genitalia, the sex hormones, the gametes that are found. These are obviously not very discrete, largely non-overlapping endpoints. Then the last thing we talked about, and this is where we're going to bring in the PSE a little bit, so we're going to do a little PSV review, is talking about the SRY gene. This is a gene that is found just on the Y chromosome, and it is the testis determining factor. So if an individual, when it is developing in utero, there's going to be the development of the bipotential gonad, and that if that individual has a Y chromosome with an SRY gene on it, the SRY gets turned on in the bipotential gonad, and it will then eventually turn into a testis. If that individual does not have an SRY gene, then the bipotential gonad defaults into turning it into an ovary. And that the SRY protein acts as a transcription factor, meaning it affects the expression of lots of other genes. So it turns on testis-specific genes, and it turns off ovary-specific genes. And so therefore, and that's SRY driving this entire process, right? So SRY then takes that bipotential gonad and then pushes it towards the testis type of form and away from the ovary type of form. And then eventually what happens is that bipotential gonad is then turned into a testis, and therefore the testes start to produce testosterone in utero, which then masculinizes the fetus. It leads to regression of some feminine reproductive structures, and then masculinizing some of the reproductive structures to look masculine, such as turning the clitoris into a penis and closing up the vulva. Now, the PSC referred to what would happen to an individual if they have a mutation for SRY, like resulting in a non-functional SRY protein. What is the answer to that question? Yes, David. Right. What would be the first thing that might occur? Right. So the first thing is that they're largely going to have an ovary. These individuals, so if anyone bothered to look up the condition, so this is a real condition that people are born with, the ovaries don't necessarily develop fully. They tend to have underdeveloped ovaries. This is very similar to Turner syndrome, right? Turner syndrome are those individuals that also have just one X chromosome. So early on in embryogenesis, they do need both X chromosomes to help contribute to having a fully developed ovary. So in this case, right, if they have a Y chromosome, but the SRY gene is messed up, well, then they end up with somewhat underdeveloped ovaries. But then they're born, then there's a whole cascade of things that occur, right? If they don't have testes, therefore they don't have testosterone, and therefore testosterone doesn't masculinize the fetus. Therefore, they're born with female genitalia. Therefore, they are usually determined to be girls as when they are born, and they grow up feeling and acting like women, but genetically they are male. They have XY chromosome arrangement. So that is what typically results for individuals born with this condition. Okay, questions on that? So we'll be talking about other examples of that as we go on in this part. Okay, so that are similar in nature. Okay, so as I mentioned, if someone has XY chromosome arrangement, they have a functional SRY, the testes develop, the testes start to circulate testosterone, and this happens in utero. So that then masculizes the fetus. In females, they don't have testes, so therefore they don't have any testosterone, and they also aren't producing estrogen in utero. Like the ovaries are not producing any hormones whatsoever. So then that means that there's all these sex hormones running around the XY individual, masculizing it. This is also true that it's masculizing certain parts of the brain, as we talked about. And then there's a hiatus during juvenilehood, and then once they reach puberty, then both either the ovaries or the testes start to produce their respective sex hormones, which then activates sexual reproductive type behaviors and also allows for the development of secondary sex characteristics. So if you're talking about humans, like the growth of facial hair, deepening voice, growth of breasts, changing in the hips, those kinds of things. I also did talk about like how this happens, like how the brain controls the release of these hormones. I'm just going to skip to that because I want to focus more on the genetic related aspects, which is that androgens bind to androgen receptor and estrogens bind to estrogen receptor when they enter a cell that is, say, sensitive to either androgens or estrogens. And many cells are actually sensitive to both hormones. They are expressing both receptors. So androgens will bind to androgen receptor. Then that complex acts on the androgen response element to then induce gene expression of androgen-sensitive genes. And if estrogens bind to the estrogen receptor, that will then bind to the estrogen response element. Now, an androgen response element is just a sequence of DNA, right? So you can look at a sequence of DNA and determine this is an androgen response element. An androgen receptor androgen complex will bind to this just by looking at the sequence. We know what that sequence is. Same is for an estrogen response element. It's different. And that is a promoter sequence that will be upstream of other genes that can get turned on. And then those genes will then make mRNA, which make protein, which then means that like if there's androgens present, it will bind to the androgen response element and to the androgen receptor, binding to the androgen response element, triggering androgen-sensitive genes to make those cells more masculine, to do masculine-like things, say like grow facial hair or thicken the vocal cords or grow muscles, those kinds of things. Whereas estrogens will bind to the estrogen receptor and then turn on genes that will do more feminizing type things. And it'll turn on genes related to feminine traits. Does that make sense? Yes. That is a great question because I have an entire slide on that. So just hold on. So we talked about androgen sensitivity syndrome. We also talked about this feature, how there's a sensitive period, right, in utero, that if you expose males to, if they have normal exposure to testosterone, they do normal male-like type behaviors in rodents. But if you castrate them early on, all right, so blocking the ability for testosterone to act, they default towards more feminine-like behaviors, even though they're genetically male. They're both XY. And then for females, if you expose them to testosterone early on, you can get them to do male-like behaviors as adults. And that they also then have sort of male-like hormonal control. So we can get things switched by introducing things like testosterone early on. And so one feature that we talked about that's sexually dimorphic is the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area. This area is bigger in males than it is in females in rodents. And but if you have a female that's exposed to testosterone during the critical window, largely postnatal when we're talking about rodents in those first like 10 days of life, you can get the preoptic area to grow to be more male-like. And then in males, if they're gonadectomized, they end up with a sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area that is more female-like. You can see that this looks more like this, even though that this is a genetic male. So you can get things switched and turned around in the brain by manipulating the hormone environment that they're exposed to. So genetics largely determines like what's going to happen in the brain, but there are ways that things can be deviated because there's lots and lots of steps to getting to, say, sexually dimorphic brain structures, which obviously is very important for behavior, right? So, yes. And so that gets me to talking about sex differences. So we've talked about sexual dimorphism, these things that are largely non-overlapping, like penis, vagina, um, and then like some secondary sex features as well. But many of those secondary sex features are actually overlapping, and they're more typically examples of sex differences. And what this means is that these are discrete endpoints that we can point to in that are difference between the sexes, but there's a continuum between them. So you will find an average difference. So if you measure a feature, say in males or females, they may be different statistically, but there's a lot of overlap. And what we're looking at here is an example of like how data may pan out. Now I want to just give an example that I think we're all probably familiar with, is that on average men are taller than women, right? So we can say measure the average. You can measure the men in a room and the women in a room, and on average, you're going to find that men are going to be taller than women. And this is a way we can illustrate that, right? This is just a standard bar graph showing mean and standard error, and you can see that like the men are taller than women, and of course these numbers of stars indicate significant difference, so they're statistically different from each other. So there's another way of illustrating this, which is called the scatter dot plot, and that's so these are the same data just presented in a different format, where we're now able to see each individual data point that makes up this bar graph here. Okay, and as you can see, right, like it's still showing the same thing, right? If you run the stats on this, it doesn't matter which way you draw it; it's going to show the same exact stats. But as you can see, that even though the average is taller than here, we have some individuals that where there's overlap. And in fact, you have some individuals, like some women, that are taller than even the average man here, right? It's taller than the average. And of course, there are examples of men that are shorter than the average woman, right? So you can always find examples where there's this deviation that occurs across what would typically be a sex difference, but ending up not being on that continuum. So, and these are just two examples. Yes. So of course this is a woman and this is a man, but obviously sometimes features can be where they actually deviate from what would be typical man and typical woman on some features, right? So the thing about differences, right? So there are things that are very obvious, such as like if you're talking about some species like the peacock, right? They've got these big elaborate feathers. They do this elaborate display. It's an amazing thing, but it's just the males that do this, right? And females are actually quite drab. They don't have this kind of coloration. They don't have the crazy tail feathers, so they're acting in very different ways. So there are some examples of animals where like you can see really extreme differences in their behavior. And obviously that tends to also be in those individuals where they have really extreme differences in an apparent sexual dimorphism as well. Humans are less different in that way, but there are cognitive differences that we can find. So for instance, in women, it is generally the case that they tend to do better on word related tasks. So like remembering lists of words or coming up with lists of words, women tend to do better than men. And then men tend to do better at like spatial and mental rotation type tasks. So an example of this would be like looking at these two shapes and determining if they are really the same shape, just rotated from each other, or are they two different shapes. Men tend to do better on these tasks than women. But again, I say tend because it's a difference, right? You can do this task. So say like men, if you might do the mental rotation task, maybe men are scoring higher than women on average, but you can find some women who do this task very, very well, better than all the men. Yet it could be a statistical difference. So this individual is higher than the entire distribution here, yet there's still a statistical difference. And then you can find some men who are just terrible at this task, and therefore they don't fall they fall well below the average of the other group. Yes. So in this case, these kinds of features seem to be largely not genetic because it's also environmental, right? So it's genetic to some degree, but when you say environmental, I don't necessarily mean that that it's because we're like exposing boys to all kinds of spatial rotation tasks. That is one factor. Environmental in this case can be the hormonal environment that they experienced in utero. And we'll see an example of how this deviates from looking at an example of intersex that shows this. Yeah. So additional definitions that's important in this because we're getting more and more human focused, right? So we've been talking about sex, right? The two main categories of male and female, and of course we can do that for humans to some degree. There's also gender, so that's something that is not something we associate with animals that are non-human. That's something that's a concept that's related just to humans alone. That is the characteristics of women, men, boys, and girls. These are things that are largely socially constructed. It includes like the norms and behaviors and roles associated with a given sex, associated with being a man or a woman or a boy or girl, and this can vary across cultures too. It also can be related to the relationships that men and women have with each other, or men to men, or woman to woman. And then there's also the condition of intersex. Now, I've referred to intersex a couple of times. I referred to it last time, but intersex is a variety of conditions where a person may have reproductive or sexual anatomy that doesn't seem to fit in the typical definitions of male and female. And so I'm just going to talk about a couple examples of that, including androgen insensitivity syndrome, which is what London brought up. So glad you brought it up. So there's a condition known as complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. These are individuals that have XY chromosome arrangement, and they are phenotypically female, though. So they look and act like a typical woman. But they have testes. Okay, okay. Let me back up. So the mutation that they have is that they have a mutation in the androgen receptor. So given what you know about like the development of the bipotential gonad and SRY, what do you think is happening with these individuals? Like what's going on here? Yeah.
They can't bind hormones like FH and plus H, so they have
Right.
development that's like incomplete or like halted.
Well, they combine FSH and LH because they have functional. Those are the gonadotropins, and they can bind that. So they have gonadotropin receptors. What they don't have, they have a mutation in the androgen receptor. So what hormone can't they bind?
Testosterone.
Testosterone, yes, and dihydrotestosterone, exactly. So the testosterone can't act. So they have a functional SRY gene. So these individuals, they have a functional SRY gene, so they do develop testes. So they have regular testes in utero. And in utero, they start to produce tons and tons of testosterone. In fact, more than what you see in a typical male that has a functional androgen receptor. But all this testosterone is coursing through their veins, but it can't do anything because the androgen receptor is broken. That is the lock, right? It's as if you have a key, but someone smashed the lock and you can't get your key in. You could have 1,000 keys, it won't matter because the lock is smashed. It won't actually open up the door. And that's exactly what this is like here. So they have a smashed lock, and therefore the key can't work. And so they gotta have 1,000 testosterones floating around, and it won't matter because it can't bind to the receptor. It won't work. The receptor won't do its job. And so these people have a mutation. So therefore, even though their testes in utero are producing all kinds of testosterone, it circulates around the body, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't actually it doesn't masculinize the tissues. It doesn't turn the clitoris into a penis. It doesn't close up the vulva. So all those things then develop down the normal female path. And the other thing that's really interesting about these individuals is that they tend to have very low body fat. They also have really no body hair, no secondary body hair, so they have very low body hair. They have no body odor, so and also no acne. So they don't really develop any acne whatsoever. They have really good skin, and a lot of times they don't even have to like take regular showers, which sounds crazy. Like I have to take regular showers because I stink. I'm a stinky boy. Yeah, we all know. If you spend any time around me, you know that. So basically all of us do too, but these individuals actually don't because it's actually testosterone that courses through your body that causes that body hair. That's why boys tend to be much stinkier than girls, but it also shows that girls also have some testosterone. So they have a little bit of testosterone in their hormonal environment. They also have androgen receptor, and it's actually testosterone that's causing a lot of those features for women. So like, there is female deodorant, and obviously some women get acne, but it can be much worse for men because they have much more testosterone. Gesundheit. So yeah, but these individuals don't have any of those issues because even though they have tons of testosterone, it doesn't do anything for them because it doesn't actually bind to the receptor because the receptor is broken. Okay, super fascinating phenomenon. Yeah.
Is it the shape of the receptor itself?
So there's different varieties of complete androgen insensitivity. Oh, of androgen insensitivity syndrome. There's lots of different varieties because sometimes it's somewhat functional, so they have diminished. So there's more complex versions of it. Yes, but complete, yes. So it's partial androgen insensitivity syndrome. Complete androgen insensitivity syndrome is this condition where the individual is born female but genetically male and has like the complete lack of like body odor things going on. So. All right, another intersex condition I want to talk about is called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So these are individuals that have a mutation for 21 hydroxylase. So this is located on the 6th chromosome. And 21 hydroxylase is an enzyme that's involved in steroid synthesis, specifically in making cortisol. Which gland makes cortisol? Hopefully you remember this. It's shown right here. The adrenal gland, yes. So these are individuals that have a mutation that complicates their ability to make cortisol. In fact, they can't. They cannot make cortisol whatsoever. So this is showing the pathway that CYP21 is involved in. So cortisol, let me just go to cortisol synthesis pathway. Okay, I'm just illustrating this for purposes of showing that you start off with cortisol, and then as long as you have the right kinds of enzymes involved, you can turn cortisol into, you can turn cholesterol. So you start off with cholesterol. You can go through a number of steps, including 21 hydroxylase, which is right here. Eventually, as long as you have a functioning 21 hydroxylase, you will end up with cortisol. And the adrenal glands are supposed to be doing this, including in utero. But if you have a mutation for 21 hydroxylase, you can't get to this side of the pathway. This side doesn't work, which means that you don't end up with the production of the stress hormones. And instead, you end up with producing lots of the precursors to those hormones. And unfortunately, what happens then is that the adrenal glands start to make use of all those precursors, and eventually you get the adrenal glands producing testosterone. So in women that are born with this condition, so these are XX chromosome arrangement, they don't have testes, they have ovaries, but in utero, the adrenal glands start to produce a bunch of testosterone. So what do you think happens to these women? Well, it says on the slide, but if you won't feel comfortable saying it, that's fine. Yes. So in utero, they have lots of testosterone being produced by the adrenal glands. So even though they have ovaries, even though genetically they're female, the adrenal glands are producing lots of testosterone, which then starts to masculinize the fetus. So these individuals are typically born with micropenis. So the clitoris gets masculinized. A lot of times the vulva is closed, so the surgeon will have to come through and open up the vulva to allow like access to the vagina. And then they also tend to have a lot of male-like behavior features. So they tend to act like, they tend to do a lot of boy-like things as children. They tend to do more boy-like types of activities than girl-like activities, even though like they are almost universally declared girl at birth. And then also, even as adults, they tend to have more male-like behaviors. So this is getting to your question, that these individuals that have this condition, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, they tend to score well on tasks that men tend to score well on, such as mental rotation tasks. So this isn't a genetic thing in that they were genetically programmed to have, say, to be really good at doing cognitive tasks that men are at, but it's because that they were exposed to androgens at a very early age, they ended up with a more masculinized brain, which ending up that they can do more masculine-like things, such as like mental rotation tasks and doing more male-directed behaviors. Yes. Yes. So boys in cognitive tasks, when you work with boys and girls, boys will tend to draw things that are more action-oriented. They'll draw more action-type things. Girls tend to draw things that are less action-oriented, more about like people and relationships and those kinds of things. Yes. Now, some of that could obviously be environmentally directed, but these girls tend to do that as well. They tend to do the same things. Yes. I potentially could, sure. Yeah. And you could certainly imagine scenarios where that might assist with sort of more, being more, developed towards mental rotation tasks. And I'm not an expert on this, issue. So, I've actually read a fair number of these types of studies, but I'm definitely not an expert. I don't work on this field. But yeah, like there probably are studies on some of those specific details. Yeah, I'd be curious to actually read them. Yes.
But CAH specifically,
Mm-hmm.
isn't that one of the disorders they test for on birth? Upon birth, immediately, it's very
Yes.
dangerous.
Yeah, because one thing that you might actually be able to pick up on here is that for individuals that are born with CAH, it can lead to some really severe sort of other problems because it's not so much that they're producing excess testosterone, although that can be an issue. The fact that they can't produce any cortisol is a big problem. So that is something that they need to have addressed immediately. Like cortisol, we think of it as a stress hormone, and it is, but it actually does a lot of other stuff on top of that. And so many times these individuals will end up with some mental handicap. So then they have to make this distinguishing of whether an individual is born with a mental handicap or not, and because it wasn't treated initially. Yes. Yeah, so that actually has nothing to do with the test itself. These are just different categories. So this would be a control woman, and then there are different varieties of congenital adrenal hyperplasia where they're either salt wasting or not, or simple virility is the other category where they actually have a less prominent form of congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So they have some virile type features, but they actually don't have full congenital adrenal hyperplasia. Yes, it actually has to do with actual assaults. Yeah. Well, let's not dwell on this too much because this is just a minor point. But I'm happy to talk about it at like afterwards. Yeah, sure. Hmm. Yep, that's it. They just have a mutation for this one enzyme, and it results in them being masculinized. Yes, it does matter. Yes, it is that specific enzyme, the CYP21, or it's known as 21 hydroxylase. This is the mutation. Yeah. Yes.
This occurs in a man, they just elite.
No. Uh-uh. No, in fact, they actually have issues. I can't dwell on it. It's actually super fascinating, and I used to ask about that in my neuroscience class. I had a whole question on an exam where they would have to work out like what happens with them. So they do have other problems. So no, they're not like super elite because they're getting like extra testosterone. Yes. Yeah, hair loss is one of them. Yeah. Yes. Right. All right. I won't move on because I gotta make sure that we have enough time to hand out exams. Oh, I didn't talk about the PSE. So I'm just gonna say real quick. This is another interesting study where, like, okay, so we talked about the SDNPOA being different between rats, in rats between male rats and female rats. You might be wondering if humans have an SDNPOA. Well, we don't really. So our brains are much bigger. The last common ancestor between rodents and humans was over 100 million years ago, but long before the dinosaurs were even killed. So there are differences, of course. And the thing is, but we do have generally the same kind of pattern. So instead of having like one SDNPOA, humans have a series of little mini nuclei in the same brain region called the INAH. And the third one is sexually dimorphic. So that is probably the SDNPOA in humans. And the third, so INAH3 is larger in men than it is in women on average. So that's sexually dimorphic. And what we have found is that there's some studies that show that homosexual men have a smaller INAH3 than heterosexual men, which is similar to like the kind of thing that we see with rodents and early hormonal environment. And this leads to the idea, this is a hypothesis, that that early hormonal exposure may be an underlying feature of things like sexual orientation and even gender identity, in that, you know, most men are going to be heterosexual. Most of them are going to have a normal sort of testosterone exposure experience early on in utero, which is going to masculinize the brain. And then most women are going to be XX chromosome arrangement. They will have like a reduced exposure to testosterone in utero. Therefore, they are doing more things that are typical for women, such as being attracted to men. Most XX chromosome women are attracted to men. But then there's obviously space in between. So this is a point of a difference and not a sexual dimorphism. There's plenty of individuals who are homosexual or bisexual or all the other kinds of varieties. And one hypothesis is that it could be that at least some homosexual men maybe were underexposed or had some diminished androgen drive early on in utero, and therefore some features were somewhat feminized, and that some homosexual women were maybe exposed to androgens, such as in the case of congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and then therefore some of their brain features were masculinized, and specifically in the case of congenital adrenal hyperplasia, they have a much greater incidence of homosexual type behaviors and have a much greater incidence of homosexuality than you would expect by chance, and also a much higher degree of transgenderism too. So the point is that getting to things like orientation and gender obviously involves many steps. We're talking about like brains that are sexually dimorphic to some degree, but lots of overlap. That it involves genes, but it also involves hormones, and there's lots and lots of steps involved to making a complex structure like the brain. And so it's easy to understand why, like, while there might be two main categories in which we can lump humans, there's overlap in between, and that are real and they exist.